You're probably familiar with the saying, it's like riding a bike, which we use for everything, from actually riding a bike to any skill that we just never seem to forget, no matter how long it's been. But have you ever wondered why riding a bike is like riding a bike? Why haven't we ever forgotten how to do it? And for that matter, how do we find ourselves from being rusty at anything to falling fairly quickly back into the groove of things once we pick it up again? If this was one of those life questions that's popping up in your head while you're trying to go to bed at night, like, they say it's like riding a bike, but do I know how to ride a bike? Why do I know how to ride a bike? I haven't been on a bike in years. Don't worry, you're not the only one. That question has kept me up too, which is why I decided to make this video, to give you that restful sleep you deserve. Now, the answer begins with how habits are made in the first place. We form a habit, any habit, the ones we like, the ones that we don't like, it doesn't matter, in the exact same fashion. In order for a habit to form, it requires three components. It requires a trigger, an action, and a reward. Now, I'm not that fancy with my videos yet, so there won't be any supporting material, just pop enough to kind of explain what's going on. You'll just have to follow my hands and my arm movements and air traffic controller thing to explain what's actually going on. So like I said, there's three components. There's trigger, there's action, and there's reward. The trigger, over here, is a small preview that the rewards, over here, are not that far behind. It could be anything and usually falls into the categories of location, time, other people, emotions, and the preceding habit. Now, once you have the go signal, you do the action, which is what we know as the habit. And this is done to receive the reward. That could be anything from I'm hungry, I'm gonna get some food, so I am not hungry anymore. Once all of this is in place, so it's repeated many times with the same outcome, we now have a habit. The better it feels, the quicker we develop this habit for it. Recall any time someone introduced you to something that changed your life. It probably only took once or twice and you were hooked. Now, we're doing all of our habits because we're looking for some form of a reward. Over here. With these components, which make up the habit loop, this is only one of the layers. The second layer after that, which isn't obvious to us, actually involves the handing off responsibilities when it comes to what's going on in our brain. In the early process of making a habit, the thinking part of our brain is very busy. It's trying to figure out the best course of action, it's noting the trials and errors, what's working and what's not working, and it's making decisions and marking all of those down. Whenever it finds something that works, it passes that plan down to a different part of the brain that's just in charge of doing it. The more times we go through the same sequence, the more things get solidified. You get the final draft version of all of the steps passed down. This is how things become more and more automatic. By the time the habit is actually formed, most of it is automatic and very little of our thinking brain is actually involved. The third layer to all of that is actually the brain wiring that changes. In order for the different parts of the brain to communicate with one another, they're going to need some kind of a system. One of those is a neuronal pathway, which is kind of like a roadmap of specialized cells that relay all of those signals on. It must be a fairly big investment of energy to build those pathways because once they are built, they stay there. Whether you drive down that road or not, as in you do the habit or not, that road remains there no matter what. Now, you can find a detour to the road or just not drive down that road again, but that road isn't going anywhere. And if you decided to drive down it again, it wouldn't take you very long to be right back in the groove of things, which is how riding a bike, something you probably learned many years ago as a child, is still something you know how to do. There's lots of examples like that. Songs you haven't heard in years will pop up when they pop up on the radio or when you randomly hear them at the grocery store, which is usually where I hear them. You actually realize you remember most of the words to it. Although this is incredibly useful for us in the progress of us as human beings, this is also the double-edged sword that once we've set up shop for something, it actually becomes incredibly hard to tear it down. So if you have ever tried breaking any of your habits, you probably found yourself pretty frustrated. Logically, you understand what needs to be done, but somehow it just doesn't seem to happen. Well, now that we have a better idea of how habits are made, we have much more insight as to why we're having some of these problems. For once, the pathway doesn't go away, so whenever you are in the same place again, you are likely to repeat the same habit again, making it harder to break. The other thing was that once habits are formed, they're automatic. We go in with our logical brain thinking, I'm going to stop doing this, but there is no spot for you to intercept that habits once it's actually unfolding. The thinking part of our brain is not really involved anymore. It's more involved in making the habit than it's actually involved in performing the habit. So here you are trying to yield into traffic, you're waiting to throw yourself in there, but no one's letting you in, and it's kind of hard to join traffic if no one's making space for you. And also, we've repeated the habit so many times just through repetition. The bond is so strong, it's going to take a lot more repetition of something different to actually change things. It's like trying to rip out a plant by the root. It's going to take a lot of effort to pull the whole thing out of the ground. And the last one is, most of the time we don't actually know exactly what the trigger is that is setting us off in the first place, making it hard not to do something when you have no clear idea why you're doing it in the first place. As mentioned, the triggers could be hidden anywhere, and they're part of the environment that we are already fairly familiar with. So when we try to change our habits, we're usually doing it in the same environment where we made the habits that we don't want to be doing as well. Because all the go signals are still there, reminds us what to do, this makes it so much harder to break the old habits. So, to answer the question from earlier, how do you not forget how to ride a bike? Well, the same way that we struggle to break the habits that we don't like is the same mechanism through how we learn how to make habits in the first place. Does that mean that I can't break my habits? The answer is we can, it's just not the way that we think. It's not just like cold stop, intercepting it like a pass in a game. We can, but we have to look at the different components of what actually makes up the habit and change those. Those would have been the trigger, the action, and the reward, if you remember from my wax on, wax off thing I was doing a little bit earlier. Because of the pathways which are formed when we make habits, it's actually a lot easier to build new ones than try to stop the old ones. It tends to be easier to build new ones because you're forming new connections without actually being in any competition with anything else that's getting in the way for you. I'm going to be making more videos on how to actually change habits and how to form new ones, but just for right now, remember how habits are made and why it tends to be hard to break them. And we'll talk about all of the stuff in the more upcoming videos.